By the middle of the 6th century BCE, the balance of power in Western Asia was suddenly no longer secure. The old Assyrian machine had already collapsed, and the states that divided its inheritance, Media in the Iranian highlands, Lydia in Anatolia, Babylon on the lower Euphrates, looked formidable but not unbreakable. Into that unstable space stepped Persia, a kingdom from the southwestern Iranian plateau that had long stood in the shadow of larger powers. Within a few decades, it was no longer a peripheral monarchy. It was the center of the largest empire the Near East had yet seen. What was at stake was not prestige in the abstract. Control of territory in this world meant control of pasture routes, mountain corridors, river valleys, fortified capitals, temple cities, caravan movement, tribute streams, and military manpower. A king who held the Zagros passes could move armies between Mesopotamia and the plateau. A king who held Sardis could reach the wealth of western Anatolia and the roads to the Aegean coast. A king who held Babylon commanded one of the richest agricultural and urban zones on earth, tied to the Euphrates, the Tigris, and the Gulf. When Persia rose, it altered the geography of power itself. The breakthrough mattered because the Near East had long been dominated by states that expanded through terror, direct subjugation, and repeated coercion, but struggled to turn conquest into durable imperial order across very different landscapes. The Achaemenids, beginning with Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great in later tradition, did something more effective. They conquered quickly, but they also held what they took. They absorbed rival elites, retained existing centers of authority, positioned royal power above local structures rather than always destroying them, and built a system that could connect the Iranian plateau to Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and, eventually, Egypt and Central Asia. Persia's success was not simply military. It was organizational. The conditions were favorable for a challenger, but only if that challenger could exploit them with unusual precision. The world Cyrus entered was fragmented, yet not chaotic. Each major state had strengths. Babylon possessed immense urban wealth and deep agricultural reserves. Lydia had access to mineral resources, minted coinage, and a strong western position centered on Sardis. Media dominated much of the Iranian highland zone and had inherited strategic weight from the collapse of Assyria at the end of the 7th century BCE. But each power also sat on structural weaknesses, stretched frontiers, dependent subject peoples, elite rivalries, uncertain succession, and the difficulty of campaigning over long distances through mountains, river systems, and semi-arid plateaus. Persia's rise, therefore, did not begin as an inexplicable explosion of genius. It began in a hard environment that rewarded mobility, coalition building, and resilience. The Persian homeland in Fars, ancient Parsa, lay on the southern Iranian plateau, where valleys, uplands, and routes toward Elam and the Gulf created both opportunity and constraint. Any ruler there had to think in terms of movement, where cavalry could operate, where supply could be sustained, which passes were defensible, which settlements could anchor authority, and how to turn a regional power base into something broader. Cyrus did not inherit an empire. He inherited a position from which an empire could, under the right pressure, be made. That pressure came from the larger political field. The generation after Assyria's fall had produced a new order, but not a settled one. Media and Babylon had shared in Assyria's destruction. Lydia had checked Median advance in Anatolia. Smaller kingdoms and cities across Syria, western Iran, and the Anatolian coast lived between great powers, paying tribute, shifting loyalties, and watching for openings. No state could ignore the others. Each campaign in one theater threatened to expose another frontier. In that environment, a fast-moving and disciplined ruler could turn one victory into a cascade. Cyrus's achievement was to understand that empire was not the simple accumulation of land. It was the seizure of strategic nodes and the conversion of conquest into dependable obedience. Once Persia demonstrated that it could defeat Media, it gained not just territory but legitimacy, manpower, and access to the routes of the Iranian plateau. Once it took Lydia, it gained the western hinge of Anatolia. Once it entered Babylon, it gained the richest administrative and symbolic prize in the Near East. Each conquest made the next one more feasible. So the rise of Persia was not a single event and not merely the story of one man's ambition. It was a transformation in how power was assembled across Western Asia. Through geography mastered, armies moved at speed, rival elites repurposed, and conquered wealth redirected into a larger structure. To see how that structure emerged, the story has to begin not at the moment of triumph, but in the harsher ground from which Persian power first took shape. Persia was born in a landscape that did not forgive weakness. The southwestern Iranian plateau was not a soft, continuous plain from which armies could expand in every direction. It was a world of uplands, enclosed basins, broken ridges, dry stretches, and routes that narrowed into passes before opening toward richer zones. To the west lay Elam and the road toward Susa and Mesopotamia. To the north rose the long barrier systems and corridors leading toward Media. To the south, the Persian Gulf offered maritime contact but not, at this stage, the kind of imperial center that riverine Mesopotamia provided. Geography forced Persian rulers to think strategically from the beginning. The early Persians were not isolated primitives waiting to be discovered by history. They occupied a region already shaped by older states, especially Elam, whose traditions, settlements, and political culture had long connected the lowlands around Susa to the highland interior. When Persian dynasts emerged in Anshan and Parsa, they did so in a zone with deep institutional memory. That mattered. Even before the Achaemenid breakthrough, Persian rule was being formed in conversation with older Near Eastern models of kingship, territorial control, and elite authority. Empire did not emerge from emptiness. It grew from adaptation. Material conditions shaped political possibilities. The plateau favored mobile forces, especially mounted elements, and rewarded leaders who could coordinate tribal, regional, and aristocratic support across scattered terrain. Infantry remained essential, especially in siege work and occupation, but the ability to move fast between valleys, highlands, and frontier roads was a strategic advantage that Persian rulers learned to exploit. The horse was not a decorative symbol in this world. It was an instrument of command, pursuit, communication, and shock. A kingdom that could draw on highland manpower and maintain movement across difficult terrain possessed a military profile very different from the heavy urban states of the Mesopotamian lowlands. At the same time, the Persian homeland lacked the concentrated agricultural wealth of Babylonia. It could support a power base, but not one on the scale of an imperial metropolis without expansion. That was a structural fact with political consequences. Persia's rulers had reason to look outward, not simply because conquest was glorious, but because secure access to richer lands, trade routes, tribute networks, and strategic centers was the most reliable way to sustain a larger military and dynastic project. Expansion was not predetermined, but once a Persian king achieved decisive momentum, the logic of the region pulled him onward. The Achaemenid line itself remains partially obscured in the earliest phases, but what matters for the rise of empire is clear enough. By the 6th century BCE, Persian kings ruled a compact but viable polity in Fars, linked to older centers such as Anshan and positioned at the intersection of plateau and lowland worlds. They were not yet the masters of Western Asia. They were subordinate, or at least constrained, within a wider political order dominated by Media. That subordinate position was important. It exposed Persian elites to imperial practice from above while preserving their own regional base below. When the chance came to revolt, they knew both how great powers operated and where they were vulnerable. This combination of hard terrain and political subordination produced a distinctive strategic culture. Persia could not rely on monumental urban concentration alone. It had to rely on flexible leadership, negotiated loyalty, and the capacity to knit together people who were not all bound by the same local interests. That habit of coalition would become one of the empire's greatest strengths. The Persians learned early that authority in the highlands was not maintained by raw force alone. It required recognition among powerful houses, command over routes, and the ability to reward service with status, land, and inclusion. The contrast with older imperial models is revealing. Assyria had projected force outward from a heavily militarized core and repeatedly devastated regions that resisted. Persia would also use force, often decisively, but its environment had prepared it for another method: absorb, reposition, and command through layered authority. The southern plateau was not merely a backdrop to Cyrus's later conquests. It was the training ground in which the mechanics of Persian expansion were first tested. That matters because when Persia later moved against Media, Lydia, and Babylon, it did not do so as a raw tribal eruption. It moved as a kingdom already accustomed to difficult geography, regional bargaining, mounted warfare, and the necessity of turning scattered strength into coordinated action. The empire's later scale can only be understood by starting with those constraints. From the plateau's hard edges came a political system ready to exploit the next fracture in the Near Eastern order, the Median one. Before Persia could become an empire, it had to emerge from under the shadow of Media. In the decades after the fall of Assyria, the Medes were the dominant power of the Iranian highlands and a critical force in the redistribution of territory across the Near East. Their role in the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE, alongside Babylonian forces, placed them among the principal heirs of Assyrian collapse. Whether Media was as centralized an empire as later Greek writers sometimes imply is debated, but its political weight was real enough. It controlled, influenced, or overshadowed a broad zone stretching across the Zagros and into the plateau. That Median dominance mattered in two ways. First, it checked Persian independence. Persian rulers operated within a system in which Median power set the terms of hierarchy. Second, it transmitted imperial habits. Even if Media was more a federation of aristocratic and regional powers than a tightly administered empire, it still offered a model of how authority could be projected over diverse terrain through alliances, military pressure, and command of key centers such as Ecbatana. Persia's future empire would in some respects be built through the capture and redirection of this Median framework. The Zagros mountain system was central to the contest. These ranges did not simply divide Mesopotamia from Iran. They contained the passes through which armies, tribute, and political influence moved. A power that dominated the Zagros gateways could threaten Assyria in one generation and Babylon in another. It could also choke off or enable movement between lowland and plateau. Media's strength rested in part on holding this strategic belt. Persia's rise required breaking that hold and inheriting the communications network it sustained. By the time Cyrus appeared, the Median order may already have been more brittle than it looked. Great upland powers often faced a recurring problem: how to keep regional nobles, mounted war bands, and frontier authorities aligned once the immediate pressure of expansion eased. Succession could reopen rivalries. Distance weakened direct command. Tribute and obligation had to move through personal relationships as much as fixed institutions. If the center faltered, peripheral rulers could become dangerous. A subordinate king in Persia who could attract support within and beyond the Median sphere represented exactly that kind of danger. Cyrus's later success is easier to understand if Media is seen not as a monolithic empire brought down by miracle, but as a powerful state vulnerable to defection, miscalculation, and internal fracture. Ancient traditions preserve stories of Astyages, the Median king, losing support among his own followers. The details are contested and often colored by later storytelling, but the larger pattern makes sense. An ambitious challenger could prevail if he united Persian strength, won over dissatisfied Median elites, and moved fast enough to prevent the conflict from becoming a long war of attrition. The very structure of Median power may have made that possible. If authority rested on ties among nobles and subject rulers rather than on a dense bureaucratic chain, then a decisive political and military break at the top could trigger rapid collapse below. That is what made the coming Persian revolt so consequential. Cyrus did not need to annihilate every Median force in every province. He needed to shatter the legitimacy of the ruling center and present himself as the new focal point of highland power. Once that happened, the apparatus of command, elite allegiance, mounted manpower, routes, and strategic capitals could be transferred rather than rebuilt from scratch. This is one of the most important principles in the making of the Achaemenid Empire. Persia advanced not only by destroying rivals, but by taking over systems that could still function after conquest. It was efficient in a way many conquerors were not. Where a lesser victor might have produced vacuum, Persia produced continuity under new masters. That capacity would later explain why the fall of Sardis and Babylon did not yield chaos, but incorporation. The Median context, therefore, was not a prelude to be skipped over on the way to Cyrus's fame. It was the first real proving ground of the Persian imperial method. In order to understand why Cyrus could move from local king to conqueror of Western Asia, the next step is to see how he turned a revolt against a superior power into a transfer of empire. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus moved from subordinate ruler to kingmaker in the full sense of the term. The revolt against Astyages, the Median king, was not merely a dynastic quarrel inside the Iranian world. It was a strategic reordering of power across the plateau. If Cyrus failed, Persia would remain a regional kingdom hemmed in by stronger neighbors. If he succeeded, the center of gravity in the Iranian highlands would shift southward, and the resources of Media would become available for further expansion. The stakes were immediate and immense. The sources for the conflict are uneven. Greek authors, above all Herodotus, preserve dramatic narratives full of reversals and court intrigue. Near Eastern evidence is briefer and more sober. What can be said with confidence is that Cyrus defeated Astyages and took Ecbatana, the Median capital. That result alone tells us much. Ecbatana was not just a royal residence. It was a strategic center linking the Iranian plateau to routes westward and northward. To seize it was to seize the commanding node of Median power. How did Cyrus win? No single explanation is sufficient, but several elements recur. First was coalition building. A revolt of this scale could not succeed on Persian manpower alone. Cyrus appears to have benefited from defections or support among Median elites, which suggests that his campaign was political as much as military. Second was speed. In struggles where legitimacy hangs on battlefield outcome, rapid movement can break a larger state before it fully mobilizes. Third was the ability to convert victory into possession. Cyrus did not simply defeat a king in the field and ride home with plunder. He occupied the Median center and took over the structure behind it. This was the first major demonstration of Persian imperial talent. Many rebellions succeed in destroying authority and then fail to replace it. Cyrus did the opposite. By assuming control of Median resources, he acquired access to cavalry traditions, highland manpower, and the routes that connected the interior of Iran with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. He also inherited a political argument. If the old ruling house had fallen and the great center had submitted, then other elites had reason to recognize the new king rather than resist pointlessly. Power, once visibly transferred, often travels faster than armies. The conquest of Media also gave Persia something no frontier kingdom could easily generate for itself: scale. Cyrus now commanded a realm that could sustain large campaigning efforts beyond the Persian homeland. With Ecbatana and the broader Median sphere in hand, he could threaten the west without exposing his rear. He could also move against eastern and central highland regions from a position of superior reach. Even where evidence is thin on the sequence of early eastern submissions, the strategic logic is clear. A king who controlled both Persia and Media had become the dominant military actor of the Iranian world. Equally important was the symbolic shift. Conquest in the ancient Near East was never only material. Rulers needed to be accepted as legitimate holders of kingship in the lands they ruled. Cyrus appears to have understood this from the start. He did not present himself as the destroyer of an entire order. He positioned himself as its new sovereign. That reduced resistance, preserved utility in conquered institutions, and helped ensure that the fall of one regime did not become a general war of survival among all its former subjects. The Median victory, therefore, was not a local Persian success inflated by later legend. It was the decisive transition from kingdom to expansionary power. It changed the military balance of the plateau, unlocked strategic depth, and demonstrated a method Cyrus would repeat: exploit fracture, take the center, preserve what can serve, and move before rivals coordinate. Once Media had been absorbed, the neighboring powers could no longer treat Persia as a subordinate state. They were dealing with a new empire in formation. That new empire now faced a larger question. Possessing the Iranian highlands was one thing. Converting that position into supremacy across Western Asia required Cyrus to test Persian power against the wealthiest and most established kingdoms beyond the plateau. The next stage would show whether Media's fall had created a regional hegemon, or the core of something far larger. After the fall of Astyages, the most dangerous outcome for Cyrus would have been fragmentation. A conqueror can win brilliantly, and still lose the peace if the defeated state breaks into resistant regional blocks, rival commanders, and hostile frontier zones. That does not seem to have happened on a catastrophic scale. Instead, Persia absorbed Media with striking effectiveness. This was not inevitable. It was the result of a deliberate imperial method already coming into focus. The first requirement was holding key centers. Ecbatana mattered not only because it had been the Median capital, but because it was a logistical hinge. From there, royal authority could look west toward the Zagros, south toward Elam and Susa, east toward the interior plateau, and north toward highland approaches. Control of capitals in the ancient Near East was always more than ceremonial. Capitals stored wealth, projected legitimacy, and anchored networks of movement. A king in possession of Ecbatana had inherited a command platform. The second requirement was elite cooperation. Cyrus does not appear to have tried to erase the Median nobility as a class. That restraint was practical. Median aristocrats possessed military followings, regional authority, and knowledge of terrain and local politics. By incorporating them, Cyrus strengthened rather than destabilized his new realm. The result was not equality between Persian and Median elites, but partnership under a Persian king. This was one of the earliest and most consequential decisions in Achaemenid history. It turned a conquered rival into part of the imperial core. The third requirement was strategic depth. Once Persia and Media were joined, the new state could campaign beyond its original homeland without gambling everything on a single line of communication. The Iranian plateau offered room, manpower, and multiple axes of movement, but only to a ruler who could coordinate them. Cyrus now possessed that capacity. If unrest appeared in one region, he was not confined to Fars. If an external enemy advanced, the empire could respond from more than one center. Conquest had widened the Persian margin for error. This matters for understanding why Persian expansion accelerated rather than paused after 550 BC. States that conquer reluctantly often stop to stabilize. States that have discovered a scalable method of rule can keep moving because each success makes the next easier. That seems to have been the Persian pattern. Median incorporation strengthened the army, increased legitimacy, and widened access to tribute and supplies. It also sent a message across the Near East. Resistance to Cyrus would not necessarily restore the old order, because the old order had already been replaced. There were almost certainly campaigns and submissions in the east and northeast during this period, though the evidence is not always precise enough to reconstruct a simple sequence. Regions such as Parthia, Hyrcania, and perhaps territories further towards Central Asia came within the Persian sphere early enough to matter for the empire's later shape. Even where local arrangements varied, the strategic result was significant. Cyrus was securing the flanks of the Iranian world before facing the largest Western powers. He was not charging blindly toward glory. He was making sure his rear would hold. This was smart campaigning in a zone where distance could destroy armies as effectively as battle. To move west against Lydia or south toward Babylon while leaving unstable frontiers behind would have been reckless. By consolidating the plateau and broadening recognition of Persian kingship, Cyrus reduced the chance of simultaneous war on multiple fronts. He also increased access to horses, levies, and provisions from a wider territorial base. Geography had set the problem. Incorporation solved it. What emerged by the late 540s BCE was a state no longer defined by Persian ethnicity alone. It was an imperial coalition ruled by a Persian dynasty, drawing on Median and other highland strengths, and now capable of sustained operations against older, richer monarchies. The conquest of Media had given Cyrus the frame of empire. Consolidation made that frame durable. The West now demanded attention. Beyond the Halys River stood Lydia under Croesus, a kingdom wealthy, militarily experienced, and connected to the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast. If Cyrus could defeat Lydia, Persia would reach the Aegean-facing edge of Anatolia and acquire another strategic pillar. If Lydia held, Persian expansion might stop at the plateau's western rim. The coming campaign would test whether Cyrus's new empire could beat a state built on very different strengths. Lydia was the first great Western power that Persia had to break on fully external ground. Centered on Sardis in western Anatolia, the Lydian kingdom commanded rich agricultural land, access to metal resources, and routes leading to the Aegean littoral and the interior of Asia Minor. Under Croesus, Lydia enjoyed a reputation for wealth so enduring that his name became a byword for riches in later memory. But Lydia's real significance was strategic. It sat at the western hinge of the Near East, linking inland Anatolia to the Greek coastal cities and the maritime world beyond. The confrontation between Cyrus and Croesus was not accidental. Once Media had fallen, the balance established earlier between Median and Lydian spheres could not survive. The Halys River, which had once marked a rough frontier after previous conflict, no longer separated two stable powers. It marked the line between a rising empire and a kingdom that had to decide whether to strike, wait, or retreat. In such situations, hesitation can be fatal because the state with the stronger momentum gains allies and shapes the terms of battle. Ancient accounts differ on the details, but the broad campaign pattern is clear. Croesus moved east and fought Cyrus, probably near Tyria in central Anatolia. The battle appears to have been hard and inconclusive, but what followed was decisive. Croesus withdrew, likely expecting to regroup, call up allies, and resume operations in the next campaigning season. Cyrus did not give him that time. He pursued rapidly into Lydia, forcing the issue before the Lydian king could rebuild his coalition. This was classic Persian exploitation of tempo. Deny the enemy the calendar he expects. That operational choice mattered more than any single tactical flourish. In ancient warfare, where levies dispersed seasonally and allies required time to assemble, the ability to continue a campaign through moments when an opponent assumed a pause could collapse an entire strategic plan. Cyrus's army, hardened by highland campaigning and backed by a broader imperial base after the Median conquest, was able to maintain pressure. Mobility, not merely bravery, broke Lydia's position. The final contest centered on Sardis. The city's acropolis was strong, and western Anatolian terrain did not favor an easy assault. Yet Sardis fell, and with it the Lydian kingdom. The capture was more than a battlefield victory. Sardis was a treasury, a road nexus, and the political key to western Anatolia. By taking it, Cyrus gained access to the resources of Lydia and the submission of the territories bound to it. Once again, Persian expansion worked through the seizure of a strategic center that converted military success into durable control. There is a larger pattern here. Cyrus did not merely defeat enemy armies in open country. He targeted the places from which rival kings actually ruled. That is one reason his conquests lasted. Without Sardis, Croesus could not easily continue as king of Lydia even if pockets of resistance survived. Without Ecbatana, Median restoration was unlikely. Persia was not collecting victories. It was dismantling opposing state systems by taking their command nodes. The military lesson was equally clear. Persian warfare combined flexibility with practical intelligence about different terrains. Anatolia demanded different operations from those of the Iranian plateau. Longer lines, fortified centers, and mixed local forces required adaptation. Cyrus's success indicates that the Persian army was not a single rigid instrument, but a coalition force able to pursue, besiege, and occupy. That adaptability would become a hallmark of Achaemenid power, especially once the empire began drawing contingents from many regions. With Lydia's fall, the map changed again. Persia now stood not only as master of the plateau and the western highlands, but as the dominant power in inland Anatolia. The wealth of Sardis, the submission of western territories, and the access to the Aegean-facing zone opened a new frontier. Yet this western victory also created a fresh problem: how to rule territories tied to Greek cities, local dynasts, and coastal trade networks without overextending Persian force. The answer would reveal even more about the empire Cyrus was building. The conquest of Lydia did not automatically give Persia secure control of western Anatolia. It gave Cyrus the key, not the completed lock. Beyond Sardis lay a crowded political landscape. Inland communities with older loyalties, local rulers calibrated to Lydian power, and, above all, the Ionian and Aeolian Greek cities along the coast. These cities were commercially active, militarily variable, and accustomed to navigating between stronger powers. Persia had entered a zone where command could not depend on one capital alone. It required layered control across roads, strongpoints, and subordinate authorities. This is where the distinction between conquest and empire becomes sharp. A conqueror might plunder Sardis and leave. Cyrus could not, because Western Anatolia was too valuable to abandon. It offered tribute, manpower, coastal access, and a forward position at the edge of the Aegean world. More importantly, leaving the region unstable would invite renewed coalitions against Persia from local powers, displaced elites, and foreign partners. Holding Lydia meant building a Western frontier system, not simply celebrating victory. Persian control proceeded through a mixture of force and substitution. Existing Lydian structures could be used where they remained useful, but the supreme authority now belonged to the Achaemenid king and his appointed representatives. Sardis became one of the major Western centers of imperial power, precisely because it was already so well placed. It connected the Anatolian interior to the coast and sat astride routes that later would matter enormously for communication across the empire. Strategic geography again guided Persian decision-making. Rule was anchored where movement converged. The coastal cities presented a different challenge. Some resisted, others submitted on terms. Persia's advantage here lay less in immediate naval supremacy than in continental reach. A coastal city might be hard to intimidate from the sea, but it still depended on access to inland resources, surrounding countryside, and regional stability. Once Persia controlled the interior and the major road systems feeding the coast, many cities had limited room to maneuver unless a larger outside power intervened. The empire's strength in western Anatolia therefore rested on its ability to dominate hinterland and corridor, not merely shoreline. This was a pattern the Achaemenids would repeat elsewhere. They excelled at holding the connective spaces of empire, river valleys, passes, crossroads, and agrarian cores. Maritime autonomy could complicate their rule, but if the imperial center commanded the land routes, the larger balance still favored Persia. In Anatolia, that meant that local resistance could be dangerous and expensive, but not necessarily decisive. The empire was learning to rule edges from inland nodes. The economic consequences were substantial. Western Anatolia linked the inland Near East to the Eastern Mediterranean exchange system. Sardis had long been associated with royal wealth, and the wider region contained productive land, skilled populations, and access to routes that fed both tribute and trade. By incorporating Lydia, Persia broadened its resource base far beyond what the plateau alone could provide. Wealth now moved eastward toward the imperial center, while royal authority moved westward toward the coast. Expansion and consolidation reinforced each other. Equally important was prestige. The defeat of Croesus, one of the most celebrated kings of the age, announced to the wider Near East that Persia could beat a wealthy Western monarchy as decisively as it had beaten Media. This altered diplomatic calculations everywhere. Subject peoples under other great kings could see that resistance to old regimes no longer guaranteed their survival. Rival rulers could see that waiting for Cyrus to stop had become a dangerous illusion. Each Persian success weakened the political confidence of those still outside the empire. Yet the greatest prize still lay to the south. Lydia had given Cyrus Anatolia's western hinge. Babylon offered something even more consequential. The richest urban agricultural core in the region, immense symbolic prestige, and control over Mesopotamia's lower river world. To take Babylon would require a different kind of campaign from the one against Lydia. Less a contest for a frontier kingdom than a bid for the center of civilization itself. The question was whether Persia's methods would work as effectively against the wealth and walls of Babylonia as they had against the kingdoms of the plateau and Anatolia. Babylonia was not merely another kingdom on Cyrus's list. It was the richest and most densely organized prize in the Near East, a land where irrigation agriculture, temple wealth, old royal traditions, and major cities combined to create an enormous concentration of resources. The lower Euphrates plain could support armies, generate surplus, and sustain urban life on a scale the Iranian plateau could not match. Whoever ruled Babylon held not just a capital, but an entire productive system tied to canals, fields, labor, and long-distance exchange reaching toward the Gulf. The city of Babylon itself also mattered in symbolic terms that were inseparable from practical rule. It was a fortress, a ceremonial center, and a seat of kingship with immense legitimacy in Mesopotamian political culture. To enter Babylon as conqueror was to claim authority in one of the oldest and most prestigious traditions of the region. Cyrus understood that he was not merely marching on a wealthy city. He was contesting the right to stand at the heart of Near Eastern power. By the late 540s BCE, the Babylonian kingdom under Nabonidus showed signs of straying. Its wealth was beyond question, but wealth alone does not guarantee strategic resilience. Long reigns, religious tensions, elite dissatisfaction, and the challenge of maintaining confidence across a complex territorial realm could weaken even a prosperous monarchy. Nabonidus's policies and absences from the main capital have been seen by many historians as sources of political friction, though the exact scale remains debated. What matters is that Babylon was vulnerable enough for a powerful external challenger to exploit internal uncertainty. The route into Babylonia was not simple. Any invading force had to move through or around the northern and eastern approaches, deal with river systems, and sustain supply in a theater very different from the highland campaigns of Iran or Anatolia. This is where Persia's expanding imperial base paid off. Cyrus could now draw on the manpower and resources of a large trans-regional state. He was no longer a king riding from one frontier gamble to another. He was commanding an empire that had already shown it could support long campaigns across varied terrain. The decisive military turning point appears to have come in 539 BCE, when Persian forces defeated the Babylonians at Opis on the Tigris. That battle was crucial because it broke organized resistance in the northern gateway to Babylonia. From there, the sequence moved quickly. Sippar fell without a major fight, and Babylon itself was entered soon after. Later traditions embroidered the city's capture with dramatic tales, including river diversions and nocturnal surprise. Some of those stories may preserve fragments of truth, but the strongest evidence suggests a rapid political and military collapse once the outer defensive structure failed. This speed is revealing. Great capitals do not usually fall because one trick is played at one moment. They fall because a larger system has ceased to function. Once field resistance was broken, once confidence in the ruling king weakened, and once elites judged accommodation safer than destruction, even a city as formidable as Babylon could be taken with less prolonged devastation than later imagination preferred. Here again, Cyrus's method stands out. He combined military success with political absorption. He came not simply as breaker of walls, but as claimant to legitimate kingship. That distinction mattered immediately. A sack might enrich an army for days. A recognized transition of rule could enrich an empire for generations. By entering Babylon in a way that preserved its value, Cyrus gained access to enormous resources: grain, silver, labor, skilled personnel, religious prestige, and command over one of the great urban systems of antiquity. Persia had now joined the plateau, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia under a single crown. The scale of the achievement is hard to exaggerate. Yet victory created new obligations. Babylon could not be ruled as Lydia had been, nor Lydia as Media had been. Each region required continuity in different forms. If Cyrus was to hold this growing empire together, he needed more than battlefield success. He needed a system by which conquered peoples could recognize Persian rule as the new normal. The conquest of Babylon, therefore, leads directly to the central question of the Achaemenid Age. How was an empire of such size actually made governable? Persian success in Babylon rested not only on force, but on the controlled use of legitimacy. This was one of Cyrus's greatest strengths as a conqueror. He did not present himself simply as the foreign destroyer of an old civilization. He presented himself as the ruler who had restored proper order after a failing kingship. That was not soft sentiment. It was imperial technique, and it helps explain why the Achaemenid Empire expanded so quickly without immediately disintegrating. The most famous piece of evidence for this strategy is the Cyrus Cylinder, a Babylonian text that presents Cyrus in traditional Mesopotamian royal terms, emphasizing divine favor, restoration, and the correction of previous disorder. It is often treated in modern culture as a timeless charter of tolerance, which misses the more important historical point. The cylinder was a political instrument. It shows that Cyrus understood how to speak the language of legitimacy in conquered lands. He did not try to govern Babylon as an alien kingdom. He placed Persian kingship inside a recognizable local framework. That had practical effects. Temples were not ornamental institutions in Mesopotamia. They were central to local order, status, and wealth. By respecting cultic structures and presenting himself as their proper protector, Cyrus reduced the likelihood that the religious and urban elites of Babylonia would become the nucleus of sustained resistance. This was not generosity for its own sake. It was the efficient neutralization of opposition through incorporation rather than indiscriminate repression. The same logic can be seen in broader imperial policy. Cyrus's rule is associated with the return or restoration of displaced cult images and with support for subject communities seeking to re-establish religious centers, including the Judeans returning to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. Such acts were not isolated gestures detached from statecraft. They reinforced a pattern. Persian rule positioned itself as guardian and arbiter of ordered local life, provided that supreme political authority was acknowledged and tribute obligations were met. Cause and effect here are straightforward. If a conquering empire leaves local institutions intact, co-opts elites, and frames itself as the source of restored stability, then the cost of occupation drops and the flow of revenue becomes more reliable. If it destroys too much, it must rebuild at great expense while facing recurrent revolt. Persia did not avoid coercion. Revolts could be crushed with force. But the default method under Cyrus was far cheaper and often more durable. It transformed conquest into compliance without requiring endless devastation. Babylon also gave Persia access to a different kind of imperial expertise. Mesopotamia possessed long traditions of administration, legal practice, large-scale resource management, and urban governance. The Persians did not invent empire anew after 539 BCE. They inherited and adapted one of the most sophisticated governing environments in the ancient world. That inheritance strengthened the empire's ability to manage distance, collect tribute, and communicate royal authority across varied regions. The plateau supplied resilience and mobility. Babylonia supplied concentrated state capacity. At the same time, the conquest of Babylon changed the psychological map of the Near East. Cyrus was no longer simply the king who had overturned Media and Lydia. He was the ruler of Babylon, a title carrying enormous regional resonance. For subject peoples and neighboring powers alike, this mattered. Imperial legitimacy grows not only from success, but from recognizable possession of the great centers. Once Cyrus held Babylon, resistance elsewhere seemed less like defense of the old order and more like refusal to accept a new one already in place. This does not mean the empire was suddenly seamless. Distance remained a problem. Frontiers still required force. Different regions had different traditions of power. But by taking Babylon in a way that preserved its utility, Cyrus demonstrated the most durable feature of Achaemenid rule: adaptability without surrender of supremacy. Persian kingship could speak in local forms while remaining unmistakably imperial. Now the challenge became structural. An empire stretching from the Iranian plateau to Anatolia and Mesopotamia could not survive on charisma or victory alone. It required mechanisms of control, circulation, and obedience that could operate across mountains, deserts, river plains, and culturally diverse populations. The making of Persia as an empire was entering its deepest phase. The Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus was not yet the fully systematized machine later associated with Darius I, but the essential logic of imperial control was already present. It began with something simple and hard: rule had to travel. A king in one capital could not command a realm of such size unless roads, relay points, garrisons, and regional authorities linked distant territories back to the crown. Geography had made Persia possible. Now geography had to be mastered administratively. Consider the scale of the problem. From Fars to Sardis was a journey across mountains, uplands, river crossings, and the long spine of Anatolia. From Ecbatana to Babylon meant descending through the Zagros corridor into the alluvial lowlands. To hold such a realm required more than moving armies at moments of crisis. It required a permanent capacity to send orders, receive intelligence, and project royal force where trouble emerged. Communication was not secondary to empire. It was empire in motion. The Persians approached this through strategic centers rather than uniform flattening of local differences. Susa, Ecbatana, Babylon, and Sardis all mattered because each sat in a different geographic and political zone. Together, they formed a chain of command across the empire's core territories. A royal presence distributed among such centers allowed the crown to remain visible and effective without pretending that one city could directly dominate every landscape in the same way. This multi-centered quality became one of the empire's great strengths. Local rule, however, was not abandoned. On the contrary, Persia depended heavily on it. Existing rulers, nobles, city elites, and regional power brokers were often left in place or reinstalled under Persian supremacy. The point was not to eliminate local authority, but to subordinate it. That reduced the manpower and time required for direct occupation, while giving the crown intermediaries who understood local terrain, language, and social structure. Loyalty was rewarded. Disobedience invited removal or force. The imperial center thus ruled through calibrated hierarchy. Tribute and resource extraction also became more reliable under this model. A devastated province produces little. A cooperating province can deliver grain, livestock, metals, labor, and military contingents year after year. Persia's genius was to see that stable subordination could be more profitable than repeated destruction. This was especially important in regions like Babylonia, where agricultural wealth depended on functioning local systems, and in Anatolia, where strategic roads and productive land made orderly rule far more valuable than plunder. Military organization remained at the core of this order. Royal authority ultimately rested on the credible ability to enforce compliance. But enforcement did not always require a massive army marching from the center. It could mean garrisons in key strongholds, loyal regional commanders, and the knowledge that the king could bring overwhelming force if a province misjudged its chances. The empire's military advantage was not only battlefield performance. It was the combination of mobility, reserve strength, and the selective application of violence. What made this system unusually effective was the way it connected legitimacy to practicality. Subject populations did not need to become Persian in language or local custom. They needed to accept Persian kingship as the supreme frame of order. In return, they could often retain local cults, local elites, and familiar ways of life. This made empire less visible in everyday culture than in the channels of command, tribute, and military obligation. That subtlety was part of its durability. Cyrus's empire therefore grew by avoiding a common imperial mistake, confusing direct control with effective control. The Achaemenids ruled vast spaces by deciding which points had to be held directly, which people had to be won over, and where royal authority had to appear unmistakable. That was a harder art than simple conquest, and few states had practiced it on such scale. Yet even the best system needed a unifying principle above roads and tribute. The empire required a concept of kingship able to bind Media, Persia, Lydia, and Babylon into one structure. It needed the crown to stand above all regional identities without becoming detached from them. In the next phase of the story, the problem is no longer how Cyrus conquered so much territory. It is how early Achaemenid rule turned conquest into a durable imperial order. At the center of the early Achaemenid Empire stood a new form of Near Eastern kingship, expansive, adaptable, and visibly universal in ambition. Cyrus did not claim to be merely king of the Persians in a narrow ethnic sense once the great conquests were secured. He ruled as king over lands, peoples, and ancient centers that had their own weight and traditions. That shift in royal identity was not ceremonial inflation. It was the ideological architecture necessary for empire. Universal rule in the ancient Near East did not mean control of the whole globe. It meant rule over the known world of power, the great river valleys, the strategic plateaus, the old capitals, the trade corridors, and the subject peoples who inhabited them. A king who held Ecbatana, Sardis, Babylon, and the Persian heartland could plausibly present himself as sovereign over the main political zones of Western Asia. That claim had to be enacted through titles, ceremonies, and public representation, but it was grounded in real conquest and real geography. This is where the Achaemenid synthesis becomes visible. Persian rule did not erase older royal languages. It absorbed them. In Babylon, Cyrus could speak in the traditional idiom of Mesopotamian kingship. In the Iranian world, He stood at the head of the Persian and Median elite coalition that had created the empire. In Anatolia, royal authority flowed through conquered centers and subordinate local powers. The same empire could therefore appear in different regional forms while remaining structurally coherent. Flexibility at the edges strengthened control at the center. Royal power also depended on movement. Early Achaemenid kingship was not fixed permanently in one capital. The court could shift among key centers, and that mobility itself was political. It allowed the king to remain connected to different parts of the empire and to demonstrate presence where it mattered. In a realm stretched across contrasting climates and landscapes, this was not extravagance. It was a practical mode of governance. The king who moved could arbitrate, reward, inspect, and display supremacy across multiple zones. The army and the court were closely linked in this system. Royal authority was visible not only in decrees, but in the capacity to assemble forces from many regions. As the empire expanded, its military became more composite. Persian and Median corps supported by contingents from conquered or allied peoples. That diversity was a strength if managed well. It widened the empire's manpower base and turned subordination into service. Men who might once have resisted Persian armies could now be incorporated into them. Military integration followed political integration. There was also a harder edge. Persian kingship offered continuity and order, but it demanded recognition. The empire could be accommodating, yet it was never loose in its conception of sovereignty. Tribute had to be paid. Commands had to be obeyed. Strategic centers had to remain in loyal hands. If negotiation failed, coercion remained available. This combination of restraint and force was essential. Too much softness invited rebellion. Too much destruction undermined the value of empire. The Achaemenids maintained authority by making both their generosity and their power credible. In practical terms, this meant that local elites across the empire faced a new calculation. Under Persian rule, they could often preserve position and wealth by entering the imperial hierarchy. Refusal was possible, but increasingly expensive and increasingly unlikely to succeed. That changed the social chemistry of power across the Near East. The empire did not simply occupy territories. It reorganized ambition. Careers, alliances, and prestige now flowed upward toward the Achaemenid king. This helps explain why Persian expansion had such momentum in the 6th century BCE. Every successful conquest weakened enemies materially, but it also attracted new cooperation. Elites in neighboring regions could see that Persian rule was not synonymous with annihilation. Submission could mean survival and continued influence. That practical incentive reduced resistance before armies even arrived. By the end of Cyrus's major conquests, the essential framework was in place: strategic capitals, integrated elites, military reach, and a kingship large enough to encompass a multi-regional empire. The next question was whether such a structure could survive beyond the first conqueror and extend into a lasting imperial tradition. The answer lay in what the early Achaemenids did after Cyrus had made the empire possible. Cyrus died in 530 BCE, probably during campaigning in the east, and that fact alone reveals something crucial about the empire he built. Even at its moment of triumph, it remained a military and frontier state. Expansion had brought immense rewards, but it had also created a perimeter that needed constant attention. Steppe-facing zones, Central Asian approaches, desert edges, and newly subordinated regions all required surveillance and force. Empire was never a static possession. It had to be defended where its limits were least settled. The succession passed to Cambyses too, and the empire did not collapse. That continuity is one of the clearest measures of Cyrus's achievement. A realm held together only by the personal charisma of a founder usually fractures at his death. The Achaemenid state did not. It transferred royal power within the dynasty and retained control over its core territories. That suggests that the empire already possessed a functioning structure of command, allegiance, and expectation strong enough to survive the loss of its architect. Cambyses's reign is most famous for the conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE. Although this lies beyond Cyrus's own campaigns, it is essential to the history of Persia's rise because it demonstrates that the imperial model he built remained expansionary and effective. Egypt was no marginal target. It was one of the richest and most symbolically important kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean world, protected by distance, desert approaches, and the Nile system. To conquer it required not only military force, but also the capacity to stage operations from the Levant and sustain a campaign across difficult terrain. The Persian victory at Pelusium opened the way to the Nile Valley and confirmed that Achaemenid methods could work far beyond the plateau in Mesopotamia. Once again, the empire prevailed by combining strategic preparation, multi-regional military resources, and the capture of decisive centers. Egypt then became another major component of imperial wealth and prestige. The crown now controlled not only the plateau, Anatolia, and Babylonia, but also the great agrarian kingdom of the Nile. The scale of rule had become genuinely transcontinental for the ancient world. That success also intensified the need for consolidation. Different lands required different modes of management. Egypt had ancient royal traditions and strong local institutions, just as Babylon did. Anatolia contained mixed populations and western-facing routes. The Iranian world remained the dynastic and military core. Holding all of these together required a clearer hierarchy of authority and more regularized channels of command than a first generation of conquest alone could provide. The early Achaemenids moved in that direction because they had to. Provincial governance under the empire was not a single uniform template from the start, but the principles are visible. Regional authority was entrusted to powerful officials and local intermediaries under royal oversight. Tribute, military obligations, and loyalty were expected. Royal centers coordinated the whole. Over time, this would develop into the better-known satrapal system of later Achaemenid rule, but its roots lay in Cyrus's original practice of ruling through layered authority rather than flattening every province into direct administration. The genius of the empire was not sameness. It was managed diversity. This system had logistical consequences. Roads had to be kept open, passes controlled, garrisons supplied, and provincial elites monitored. Strategic cities became hubs of imperial circulation. Royal messengers, military detachments, envoys, and tribute all moved through these arteries. The empire's map was therefore not just a patchwork of conquered lands. It was an infrastructure of movement connecting the Aegean-facing west, the Mesopotamian center, the Iranian plateau, and the southern and eastern frontiers. The durability of the early Achaemenid state can be measured by the fact that its later rulers, even amid crises, never abandoned Cyrus's core formula. The empire remained multi-centered, militarily mobile, and dependent on elite integration under a supreme monarchy. That was the true legacy of the founder. Not one set of slogans, but a working mechanism of imperial survival. Yet this mechanism did not become fully visible until the early empire faced its first major strain after Cambyses. Out of succession conflict and instability would emerge a more formalized expression of Achaemenid rule under Darius. To understand the historical consequence of Cyrus's conquests, one must now see how his successors converted an expanding state into a durable imperial model. The accession of Darius I in 522 BCE, after crisis and rebellion, is often treated as the beginning of the real Achaemenid Empire. That is misleading. Darius did not invent the empire from nothing. He inherited the conquests of Cyrus and Cambyses, and then gave their methods sharper institutional form. What matters for the rise of Persia is precisely this continuity. The system proved durable enough to survive turmoil, because Cyrus had already created an empire that could be reorganized rather than rebuilt. Darius's inscriptions, above all the Behistun inscription carved on a cliff along a major route in western Iran, reveal a crucial feature of Achaemenid power. Royal authority had to be made visible across space. Behistun was not hidden writing. It was political communication placed on a strategic corridor linking Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. The message was unmistakable. The king ruled by right, the rebels had lied, and the empire had been restored by force. Geography and kingship were joined in stone. Under Darius, provincial structures became more regularized, tribute more systematically assessed, and communication more strongly organized. The royal road later described between Sardis and Susa was not an isolated technical achievement. It was the expression of an imperial logic already present under Cyrus. The empire needed secure routes across enormous distance. Roads turned territorial possession into workable command. Relay stations, protected movement, and coordinated transit allowed the crown to respond faster than older empires that relied on slower or more fragmented systems. Coinage, weights, and administrative standardization also gained greater prominence under Darius. But again, the essential point is structural rather than technical. The empire was becoming easier to manage because its rulers kept refining the original Achaemenid insight. Do not erase local complexity, but bind it to the center through reliable channels of authority, movement, and extraction. This is why Persian expansion succeeded where many conquests had failed. The empire could absorb difference without losing coherence. The military reflected the same principle. Royal armies drew on many peoples and operated across multiple theaters, yet remained answerable to a central kingship whose authority was above all provincial identities. That was a remarkable achievement in a world where distance usually weakened command. The Persians overcame this not through endless central micromanagement, but by selecting which functions had to be centralized: royal legitimacy, strategic roads, major fiscal demands, the appointment of key governors, and the command of major military response. This gave the empire a resilience older Near Eastern states had often lacked. If revolt broke out in one region, the entire system did not necessarily unravel. Other provinces could still supply troops, money, and logistical support to suppress it. If one frontier became unstable, the imperial center could shift resources from another. The empire had become large enough to create its own strategic depth, but only because it had first been organized well enough to use that depth. The long-term effect on the Near East was profound. Under the Achaemenids, lands that had often existed as competing great kingdoms were now integrated into a single imperial field. Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, the Levant, and Egypt could be governed within one political framework. That changed trade, diplomacy, elite careers, military recruitment, and the very scale at which rulers thought. The empire redefined what a state could be. Cyrus's part in this transformation remains central. He established the main territorial arcs, demonstrated the method of conquest through incorporation, and created the dynastic legitimacy on which successors could build. Darius gave sharper administrative outline to a structure Cyrus had made possible. One without the other would not have produced the imperial phenomenon that dominated the Near East for 2 centuries. This is why the rise of Persia cannot be reduced to the biography of a single conqueror. It was the making of a system, begun in the plateau's hard geography, forged through the overthrow of Media, confirmed at Sardis and Babylon, and consolidated by successors who expanded the founder's method. The final measure of that system lies in its historical impact, and that impact extended far beyond the lifetime of Cyrus himself. The early Achaemenid Empire changed the Near East because it solved, more effectively than its predecessors, the problem of ruling diversity at scale. Assyria had projected immense force and built a formidable imperial tradition, but its system depended heavily on repeated intimidation and direct pressure. Babylon was rich and old, but regionally concentrated. Lydia was wealthy and strategically placed, yet limited in scope. Persia took the lessons of older states and combined them into something larger and more flexible, a multi-regional monarchy that could conquer fast, hold long, and govern without erasing local structures. Its historical footprint can be measured geographically. By the late 6th century BCE, lands from the Aegean-facing edge of Anatolia to the Iranian plateau, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, lay within one imperial order. Few earlier powers had linked so many environments under a durable crown. Mountain corridors, dry plateaus, alluvial river basins, coastal zones, and desert fringe kingdoms. This integration did not remove local difference. It connected those differences through roads, tribute, military obligation, and royal authority. The map of power had been redrawn on an unprecedented scale. The consequences were military as well as political. The empire could mobilize manpower and resources from vast territories, giving it a depth no smaller state could easily match. Campaign failures, local revolts, or dynastic crises did not automatically destroy the whole because the imperial structure had multiple cores and multiple sources of strength. Susa, Babylon, Ecbatana, Sardis, and later other centers formed a distributed architecture of rule. That made the empire harder to knock down than a state tied to one capital and one ecological zone. Economically, the Achaemenids benefited from linking major productive regions instead of merely raiding them. Babylonia's grain, Egypt's Nile wealth, Anatolia's routes and resources, and Iran's manpower and strategic position all fed one larger system. Trade moved more securely across imperial space when roads and provincial order were maintained. Tribute moved inward, but so did prestige, opportunity, and service. Elites from many lands now operated within a single imperial hierarchy, and that changed the social texture of power from the Mediterranean edge to Central Asia. The empire also altered standards of legitimacy. Future rulers in the Near East and beyond had to think against the Persian example. To be a great king now meant more than ruling one fertile core. It meant commanding multiple peoples and geographies through an organized imperial center. Even Alexander the Great, who would one day overthrow the Achaemenids, advanced not into a vacuum, but into a political world they had shaped. His campaign path and his assumptions about what a universal monarchy looked like were deeply conditioned by Persian precedent. For subject peoples, Achaemenid rule could be burdensome, coercive, and fiscally demanding, but it was also often predictable. That predictability mattered. Local cults could survive. Regional elites could retain standing. Cities could function within imperial order rather than under constant threat of annihilation. This did not make Persian rule benevolent in some modern moral sense. It made it workable. The empire endured because, in material terms, it was often easier to live under than to resist indefinitely. Cyrus's place in all of this is precise. He was not the sole architect of every later institution, nor does he need the mythic inflation that later ages supplied. His greatness lies in something more historically solid. He identified the vulnerable seams in the post-Assyrian order, struck at the right centers, and transformed a regional Persian kingdom into a trans-regional empire by mastering the relationship between conquest and incorporation. He made later Achaemenid development possible. That is why his victories remained decisive long after the battles themselves. The defeat of Astyages transferred the Iranian highlands. The fall of Sardis gave Persia the Anatolian west. The entry into Babylon delivered the Mesopotamian center. Each success expanded the empire physically, but also refined its method. Geography, mobility, elite cooperation, selective force, and adaptable legitimacy were bound into one imperial practice. By the time Cyrus disappeared from the stage, the Near East had been reorganized around a new fact. Persia was no longer a power among powers. It was the framework within which other powers now had to operate. The final question is not whether Cyrus built everything himself. It is why the structure he began proved so enduring that, for generations, the ancient world had to reckon with empire on Persian terms. Persia became an empire because it turned a regional advantage into a repeatable system of power. That system was forged under pressure. The Persian homeland on the southern Iranian plateau produced rulers accustomed to hard terrain, dispersed strength, and the need for coalition. The collapse of Assyria created a fractured world in which old powers were rich but not secure. Cyrus recognized that such a world could be mastered not by random raiding or momentary brilliance, but by taking strategic centers, preserving useful institutions, and moving faster than rivals could recover. Everything important in the rise of the Achaemenids follows from that formula. Media fell because Cyrus could combine political defection with military success and then occupy the center at Ecbatana instead of leaving vacuum behind. Lydia fell because Persia could maintain tempo, seize Sardis, and convert Western victory into frontier control. Babylon fell because the empire had become strong enough to break a wealthy lowland kingdom and skilled enough to present conquest as legitimate restoration rather than mere destruction. The pattern is unmistakable. Campaign, capture the node, absorb the structure, move outward again. What made this different from so many earlier conquests was the relationship between force and governance. Persian armies were effective because they were mobile, composite, and strategically directed. But armies alone do not explain the empire's durability. The Achaemenids succeeded because they understood that roads, capitals, elite partnerships, tribute channels, and local legitimacy were not secondary matters left for calmer times. They were part of victory itself. Every conquest was organized from the beginning as a problem of rule. Geography never ceased to shape the empire. The Zagros passes connected highland and lowland. Anatolian roads linked Sardis to the interior. The river systems of Mesopotamia and Egypt sustained concentrated wealth. Desert margins and eastern frontiers imposed constant military demands. The Persians did not eliminate these constraints. They governed through them. Their empire was a map of strategic movement. Capitals placed where routes converged, authority distributed where distance required it, and force concentrated where resistance threatened the larger system. The historical consequence was enormous. The Near East ceased to be simply a field of rival kingdoms and became, for long stretches, a single imperial zone. That transformed diplomacy, warfare, economics, and political imagination. Great kings after Cyrus inherited a world in which empire was expected to be vast, multi-ethnic, and logistically integrated. The Achaemenid model did not survive because it was gentle or enlightened by modern standards. It survived because it was efficient, adaptable, and materially grounded. This is the strongest way to understand Cyrus the Great. Not as a legend floating above history. Not as a hero of moral fable. He matters because he changed structures. He took a Persian kingdom from the margins of the Near Eastern order and used it to absorb the Median highlands, the Lydian west, and the Babylonian center. In doing so, he built the first version of a state that his successors could extend from the Aegean to the Nile and beyond. He altered the scale at which power could be organized. The empire he founded also left a lesson in practical statecraft that later ages repeatedly rediscovered. Durable conquest depends on knowing what to preserve. Cyrus did not win by flattening every land he entered. He won by understanding which elites could be turned, which cities had to be taken intact, which local traditions had to be respected, and where royal authority had to appear absolute. Persia's rise was therefore neither accidental nor mysterious. It was the disciplined construction of imperial order from opportunity, terrain, and force. By any measurable standard, territory, resource base, strategic depth, longevity of the ruling model, the Persian breakthrough of the 6th century BCE was one of the turning points of ancient history. It reordered Western Asia more completely than the careers of most conquerors ever do. After Cyrus, the problem was no longer whether a vast, durable, multi-regional empire could exist in the Near East. Persia had already answered that question. And that is the lasting significance of the Achaemenid rise. It did not merely place one dynasty above its rivals. It created a new political architecture for the ancient world, one in which mountains, plains, deserts, river kingdoms, and distant peoples could be bound into a single imperial system without losing all local form. The empire that began in the hard landscapes of Persia became the new frame of Near Eastern history, and everything that followed had to move through the space Cyrus opened.